Okay, so on the hour, and so I think we might start our session. So I'd like to welcome everyone. Okay, so thank you everyone for joining our BDH Sterling webinar today as we basically present you a great session outlining unlocking your UK pension potential in Australia. So during the session, we will share information and considerations around the tax advantages of transferring your pension, which UK pensions can be transferred, what QROPS is and where it's appropriate, and common pitfalls to avoid when transferring from the UK to Australia. So up on the screen at the moment, you see our general information slide. So now let me please take you through our general information warning. The presentation today is based on Australian and UK legislation as of today, the 14th of April 2026, and is for general information only. It is not tailored to your specific situation, so before acting on any of the information contained in today's session, we would encourage you to seek tailored financial advice specific to your needs. My name is Andrew Oakley. I am a financial planner for Australian Advice for Our Business. I am helping to facilitate today's session and assist with the Q&A at the end. Joining me today is John Vale, Senior Financial Planner. John is a dual qualified chartered financial planner in the UK with an advanced diploma in regulated financial planning, also the UK, and a graduate diploma in financial advice in Australia. While John is also a financial planner for Australian Advice, he is also a UK pension transfer specialist extraordinaire and has 15 years experience in our cross-border advice. John has the tough job of taking us through the main content that you need to know about UK pensions and potentially transferring to Australia. So today's agenda, what we have planned. So we have today's session we've broken today's session up into 5 key areas. First up, we've got types of pensions and why it might be worthwhile to transfer. QROPS, what is a qualifying, recognised overseas pension scheme? Transfer process, what it takes to transfer across and why advice is important. BDH Sterling, where and how we can assist. And also Q&A section. So we have allocated time at the end to answer questions that you may have. Please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A section of Zoom, not the chat section. And we will try and answer these as many as possible. You can find the Q&A section just at the bottom of the Zoom. There might be 3 dots there, so have a look and see how we go. If we don't get through all the questions, please feel free to reach out to us post the webinar. So moving on, let's basically get started. So the first section is types of pensions and why transfer. John, I'll leave it over to you from here on in.
All right, thanks so much, Andrew, for that very kind introduction there. And good morning or good afternoon, potentially, to everyone on the call today. As Andrew mentioned, the first section is really just talking about the types of UK pensions. So I'm going to start with some background. Apologies if you already know this, just want to really set the scene for what we're talking about today. So back in the UK, there's really only 2 types of pension schemes we're going to be dealing with. One is called the defined contribution or money purchase pension scheme. This one is potentially the more common, the more known type of pension scheme out there, quite similar in a sense to a superannuation, i.e. You pay money in, either yourself or your employer. That money gets invested into a fund of some sort, and you have that choice on how the money is invested. So whether it's a low risk profile or maybe something quite kind of racy and exciting there, on a day-to-day basis, the investments will hopefully go up, potentially go down. But over your lifetime, hopefully you have an accumulated benefit that gives you a nice large pension pot to then draw from in retirement. And the pension age in the UK at the moment is age 55. So from 55, you can retire. You can take either a lump sum. For all of us on the call today, you might remember UK rules are 25% is the tax-free amount. That's the headline figures banded about by the pension companies. But of course, you can also take a flexible income stream. So whether you can take £1 out from the policy 1 year, £100,000 out, it's completely flexible year in, year out. So the second type then is going to be called the defined benefit or the final salary. So just like it says on the tin, It's a known quantity. So the way that this works is with employer schemes, you have your employer managing that scheme. They are bearing all the investment risk and importantly, all the investment cost as well. What they're going to offer you as the employee or the member is a guaranteed income for life. Once you retire, you get to a certain age, they will pay you typically a percentage of your final salary or your otherwise career earnings and average earnings. So there's a few other factors within that formula. Length of service, you can see there, and something called the accrual rates. So the benefit again is the fact that you have no risk. Okay, it's generally indexed as well. So you get to retirement, you know that either CPI or RPI, inflation-linked pension income, will be coming your way, and you know that your spouse will have a percentage of that should something happen to you. So what I've seen over my years is anything from a 50% spouse's benefit all the way up to a 70% spouse's benefit of that same income stream. So again, it's a really nice guaranteed asset to have if you're lucky enough to have one of these defined benefit pension schemes. So you might be wondering, well, if I've got a guaranteed income, how do I transfer that to Australia? Well, the answer is, as it says there, the cash equivalent transfer value. So the scheme, the trustees, the actuaries behind the kind of curtains, so to speak, will go away. They'll work out what they think, quite honestly, you're going to live for. They're going to say, well, right, well, if we're paying X amount per year for Y number of years, this is the amount of capital that we have in our balance sheet today that we're happy to give to the member to extinguish all the future rights to that income. So you have, as it says there, 3 months to decide or to reject that offer. And of course, if you do accept the offer, you will no longer be entitled to that income stream, nor would your spouse. So it's a very important decision to be made. And for that reason, the FCA have come out and said that for any CETVs over the amount of £30,000, you must receive regulated financial advice, because the important is it's long lasting and it's material to your financial plan. So on that vein, what types of pensions can be transferred? Well, of course, we just talked about the DC and the DB types of pensions. There's two more though, I'll quickly just touch on. The first is what's known as a public sector funded DB scheme. So similar to a private defined benefit scheme there, but this time it's from the local government. Okay, so really behind the scenes, there's a pot of money that they can allocate to each and every member to, again, forego your benefits within that particular scheme. And then the final one is a QROPS. So some clients that we meet and speak to already have a QROPS, but maybe it's not the most appropriate QROPS for their needs. And so we can transfer those to another QROPS also. Importantly then, what cannot be transferred? So we do get a lot of inquiries, firstly, about the UK state pension. So I'm sure this is important for everyone to know, because everyone's looking at topping up typically their benefits. You might remember that UK state pension is based on your national insurance credits. Okay, you can have now up to 35 years of contributions towards the national insurance scheme. And that will pay you a guaranteed income through life from the age of typically 67 these days going forwards. The UK state pension, there is no pot of money, again, like these private schemes behind the curtains. There's nothing that the actuaries are having to deal with. UK state pension is actually dealt with by the annual tax revenues of the government. So money flows in through tax revenues, it gets paid out to the UK state pension members. So that one can't be transferred. And that's very similar to the public sector unfunded defined benefit schemes. So the key examples here, NHS, the civil service, the teacher's pension would be another good example of that. So again, these are guaranteed incomes, but there's no money behind the curtains to really offer the clients to take away their benefits, because they're funded on an annual basis. Okay, so those ones we can't transfer. The third bullet point here is something called the PPF, the Pension Protection Fund. So this is in relation to defined benefits. Again, if a company gets into some financial difficulty, what they've had is it's really a quasi-government agency who take over the running of those pension schemes. They offload the liabilities from those employer balance sheets and they take on the running of that defined benefit pension scheme themselves. Now, if the scheme does go into the PPF, unfortunately, it typically does mean that the member receives a bit of a haircut, so to speak, on their future pension income, but still, at least the pension is still there. It's being run by that government agency. The final one then is annuities purchased with a life insurance company. So a good example of that is you get to your retirement age, instead of going down the kind of more flexible route with your money purchase scheme, you give all of your money to a life office in exchange for a guaranteed income through your lifetime and possibly through your spouse's lifetime as well. Now, that once you've made that initial decision is no longer reversible, and therefore we can't transfer it to Australia. So I'm going to start on the side of the coin, which is why a transfer may not be suitable. So firstly, again, talking about these defined benefits especially, the FCA starting point is that it's not going to be suitable for the member, okay? And that's because they are guaranteed schemes. They offer a lot of benefit to a lot of people. And there has to be a very good justification for moving away from that type of scheme, okay? Hence the need for financial advice. So as the bullet point 2 there says, you've got the loss of guaranteed benefits. So we've got to weigh up whether a person is going to likely receive a greater financial benefit by moving away from that scheme compared to keeping it where it is presently. The other guaranteed benefits that often kind of spring to mind is in the kind of 80s and 90s, especially money purchase schemes, they had a lot of guarantees like guaranteed annuity rates. So again, I've seen pension policies come across my desk with 12 to 15% guaranteed rates where irrespective of how much the portfolio has grown by over the client's accumulation years, when they get to their retirement date, they are guaranteed 12% of that pot each and every year as a guaranteed annuity. And so those benefits there are hard to, sometimes hard to justify why we want to move away from that scheme and come into Australia or into another type of UK pension product where we wouldn't have those really quite beneficial guarantees there. The third bullet point, it relates again to DB schemes. So I mentioned that the employer of DB schemes bears the investment risk, but also the investment cost. So don't forget, we got to assess the suitability of a transfer of a defined benefit scheme for each and every person, because they would be taking on that responsibility. And you have to be cognizant of how much risk you're going to take. You have to be cognizant that you are going to start to pay product fees if you move out of one of these defined benefit pension schemes. And you may also be needing to take financial advice. So there are implicit risks and considerations to really think about in part of that process. Loss of protections, the PPF, I've talked about the Pension Protection Fund. The UK also have the Financial Services Compensation Scheme, which guarantees the vast amount of personal pension policies. So we'd be losing those. And it's not always cost or tax effective to actually move away from those UK policies. So, give you a good example is that if you don't have any taxable income, for example, in Australia, well, maybe there's a more efficient way of moving the money from A to B rather than a direct transfer. Instead, we take it as an income stream under your tax-free thresholds. So what we have to really be thinking about is what does the next kind of number of years of cash flow look like for each and every client that we speak to, and see if there's, I guess, a number of ways to skin the cat and what method best meets their goals and their objectives. So the penultimate bullet point there is talking about scams. And really what we kind of mean by that is, again, we've come across policies where, unfortunately, clients have been invested into products which have really quite substantial exit penalties, okay? And those exit penalties may last for 10 years, for example. So again, the pension transfer, it may not be suitable because those exit penalties are still in place. So maybe the advice that we would want to be talking to the client about is retaining the policy, at least for the immediate future until those exit penalties have been removed. And then we can talk about kind of the movement of the capital to Australia thereafter. But of course, it all depends on each product and each personal circumstance to work out what's best for individual member. So important then, okay, that's the downside, but what about the upside? Well, of course, simplification, that's probably the key thing that most people think about, is the fact that you don't have assets left in the UK when you want to retire in Australia. So the simplification from an administration perspective, you can more easily phone up the scheme administrator during daylight hours and get through to someone rather than having to wait for the UK offices to open up. Control of the investments. So, maybe you want to have a bit more control in your own retirement planning, control how much risk you're taking, control what currency you're investing your pension assets, your retirement assets in, especially important for members and clients living in Australia. Of course, you probably don't want to be holding on to sterling forever because eventually you're going to need to start spending your Australian dollars. Tax efficiency, the next point. So I'll get onto this point later in the presentation, but in super, the way that superannuation in Australia does work is from your preservation age beyond. If you do retire, the income stream is tax-free. Okay, so you can build up a great deal of tax efficiency in your holistic plan by having that UK money in Australia instead. Moving away from the UK rules, well, of course, you're dealing with two jurisdictions if you keep your money in the UK. So getting at least one of those jurisdictions out of the picture, again, aids to simplify your financial plan. And then estate planning and legacy planning is also. What we mean by that is, especially for defined benefit pensions, if you were to be hit by a bus, maybe your spouse will pick up 50% of the pension. But maybe you want to leave your wife or your husband more than that. And so estate planning becomes a key discussion in part of the pension transfer process, because with a QROPS, you can typically leave up to 100% of the benefits to your spouse. And so that would be a key part of understanding what a client's objectives are and whether that's a leading reason to consider a transfer. So we just touched here on the currency piece over the last decade. So over the last decade, the average between Australian dollars and pound sterling has been around about $1.85 for every pound sterling there. But of course, we've had highs of $2.10 and lows of $1.61. So from a financial planning perspective, if you are receiving that regular income stream coming from a UK pension, it does make it quite hard to plan. If 1 month it's X amount, and then second month it's Y amount. So again, just having that security, I suppose, and that ability to better plan your spending in retirement. So that all said, I'm just going to now just take a step back, just talk about how UK pension legislation has changed over the years, and to be honest, it will keep changing as well. There's a few things on the horizon that we've got to be mindful of. So these are some of the pitfalls that we've got to kind of work around, especially for some clients with those larger balances. Okay, so going back to November 2021, the government brought in something called Money Helper Guidance. So this was really to give more support to members who are looking to transfer their benefits, not just from the UK to Australia, but even UK to UK pensions. Okay, and the specific part of Money Helper, which is in relation to pensions, is Pension Wise, is what it's known as. That's, like I say, it's a over-the-phone guidance that is required by most scheme trustees to direct their members to before the transfer can go ahead. So that just gives the person really a third party to speak about their upcoming transfer, make sure they understand the risks involved, the fees involved, and really just making sure they're going into this with their eyes wide open. Moving on from there, we had in April 2024, so a couple of years ago now, we had the removal of the lifetime allowance. So the lifetime allowance previously was a cap on how much savings of UK pensions you can have before you start to pay an excess tax. Now, that did get removed, but it very quickly got replaced by three other allowances instead. So the main one that we deal with here at BDH Sterling, talking about UK pension transfers to Australia, of course, is that first one, the OTA, the Overseas Transfer Allowance. Now, the OTA is the same as the previous lifetime allowance, unless you had something called pension protection. But effectively, it means that you can transfer up to 1.073 million to a QROPS. If you have a balance above that, there is a tax charge of 25%. So there are other allowances we can use for clients with larger pension funds, the lump sum allowance being a key one there, to try and access those benefits for the member more tax efficiently. April 2025, the lifetime allowance that I talked about previously, you could have a pension protection where you could uplift your 1.073 to a higher amount. The application process got removed from that point in time. So the final one in April 2025 was actually to do with inheritance tax as well. So what was previously in place for a long, long time, the domicility rules, they were replaced by a statutory residency test. And this is different for each individual, depending on how long you lived in the UK prior to leaving. But the long and the short of it is for members who are perhaps born in the UK, typically your tail of leaving the UK needs to be at least 10 years before you're no longer liable to inheritance tax. So looking ahead, like I say, there are going to be more changes coming through. So April of next year, the big one, which is it's been in the media a lot in the UK, is the fact that inheritance tax will finally capture pension values. Okay, so for a long period of time, pensions have been ring-fenced, have been excluded from the inheritance tax regime. From April 27, they will now be caught under that particular tax act, potentially, depending on how long you've been in the UK, for example, and where your money is at that point in time. But every person has a nil rate band. Above that nil rate band, inheritance tax rates are up to 40%. So obviously fairly a sizable part of your estate planning is understanding what you're going to do with your UK pension, because we need to understand if the inheritance tax is going to impact what you do want to be doing with that money. April 2028, so a couple of years away from now, we are also going to be seeing an increase in the pension age in the UK. What is currently 55 will be moving to age 57. And if the normal pension age goes to 57, then that means QROPS must follow also. So that will soon be 57. So I want to now just try and apply some kind of real life scenarios. So I'm going to talk you through how it works for potentially a lot of you on the call today. So you've got a pension in the UK, I might presume, and I might presume also an Australian resident. So any income that you're going to take from that UK policy, firstly, if it is an income, it's going to get taxed at your marginal rates. Now, between Australia and the UK, there's what's called a DTA, a dual taxation agreement, which means that the ATO are who have the taxing rights of that income stream. So the UK would not tax it, but the ATO would. Just like employment income, you're taxed through the various progressive tax bands, and you pay tax depending on how much money you pull out each and every year. So like I say, if it's just $1, then fine, you probably sit within the nil rate band, potentially where you don't pay any tax at all. But if you decide to pull out $100,000, you're going to be up at that 32% tax bracket. The third bullet point there talks about something called the undeducted purchase price. I won't go into this too much, but if you are already drawing out a pension from the UK, typically the contributions you paid into that scheme are a deductible amount when you submit that onto your tax return. So I won't go into the details today, but just to reference the fact that there are ways to reduce the taxable amounts of income. Lump sums are different. So lump sums, if we are all sitting in the UK today, I would say to you, great, 25% of your UK policy is likely to be tax-free, no questions asked. However, the ATO unfortunately don't see that the same way as HMRC do. They don't recognize that 25% tax-free cash rule. So what they do is they would tax you on that lump sum based on something called the applicable fund earnings measure. So generally, as it says here, it's the growth in value since you first became Australian residents. And I think the next slide talks more about AFE, so I'll kind of go onto it there. But you can imagine if you're taking quite a sizable lump sum and that gets taxed at your personal marginal rates, you could be paying quite a lot of personal tax under that circumstance. So what does a QROPS in Australia look like, and what does it do? So, of course, as it says here, it's an Australian scheme, an Australian super that meets all of the HMRC requirements. Okay, that's what we're here for today, to understand what that looks like. By meeting those requirements, it allows you to bring across UK pension monies into Australia. Now, of course, it's designed for residents of Australia. And I'll go on to some tax bits later on, but we can see the fourth bullet point talks about potential tax charges. So the 25% to 55% tax charge. So 25% is if you are not resident of Australia and you bring your money into an Australian QROPS, or if you bring your money into an Australian QROPS and subsequently leave Australia within a given time frame, you can be subject to a 25% tax penalty. The 55% tax charge is if the policy that you bring your money into, the super that you bring your money into, was not an approved QROPS from the get-go. So that would be an unauthorized transfer in that instance, and obviously a fairly punitive tax penalty. So it's very important to get this right, to really understand what your obligations are if you do start to embark on this process. There are up to 10 years of reporting obligations as well. So again, it's important to understand what your, not just your short-term plan is, but what is your longer-term plan for that money, and make sure you're comfortable with those obligations. As we stand here today, there's only two QROPS options available to us in Australia. One is a retail scheme, what I like to consider an off-the-shelf solution. And the second one is a self-managed super fund, which some of you may have come across before, that allows for more investment options should the member need that or want to look at that. And so both have pros and both have cons. It's working out what's most suitable for your own needs and objectives. So I talked about applicable fund earnings on the lump sum earlier. So this is kind of what this talks about here. So it's all to do with the growth. So when you come to Australia, that's really the starting point for this growth calculation. So from the date of your arrival in Australia to the date that you transfer your UK pension into Australia, that's the time frame in which the ATO would assess the growth on your UK policy. And just quickly to take a back step and explain kind of why that is. So imagine you have $1 in a superannuation. Well, that dollar is actually taxed really behind the curtains, but it's taxed at up to 15% on capital gains. Now, the reason why, therefore, the ATO are taxing a foreign policy like a UK pension is because they're trying to equalize the benefits here. So they're going to say to you, look, you've had growth on your UK policy since your arrival in Australia. So just like that superannuation where we would tax also, we're going to tax your UK applicable fund earnings at a rate of 15%. Now, the 15% rate is actually, if you pay it within super, you can also opt to pay the tax at your marginal rates, which for some clients, again, depending on your personal circumstances, may actually be a better option because maybe you don't have any taxable earnings in that year. So we can get away with not paying any tax at all. Again, that's part of the strategy that our pension transfer specialist would be looking at. So that was the first part of the kind of twofold mechanism, the growth element. The second part is your non-concessional contribution caps. So this is tax-free upon transfer, but we are restricted by the annual caps. So at the moment, a non-concessional contribution is $120,000 per year, or we can use the bring forward, which is $360,000. So if a person has quite a large UK pension fund, we might find that we actually have to split up the pension transfer process over several years to make sure that we're keeping within that non-concessional cap limit. Interestingly, actually, it looks like, and it's not guaranteed by the, or not confirmed by the government just yet, but based on inflation data, it looks like the caps for next financial year will increase to $130,000 or $390,000 as a bring forward. So we're looking forward to seeing what the government confirm over the coming kind of weeks with regards to that. The final bullet point as well is, again, for those larger balances, what we can look at is actually a lump sum directly from the UK policy to try and reduce those larger balances in the UK. So again, there's a few different ways to skin a cat. I know I've said that a couple of times now, but there are different methods and different strategies we can use for different clients, depending on their needs and their objectives. Okay, so section 2 is going to talk through some transfer options. So some scenarios then. So age 55 and under. So, or sorry, actually, it's under 55. I should clarify. So if we were to assess a scheme, we might say to the client, well, actually, it's in your best interest to retain your current pension. The other options that we might have, though, are to transfer your current pension into another UK policy, be that a UK SIPP or a UK private pension. So a UK SIPP is very similar to a self-managed super fund here. Again, it's going to give you the ability to have a lot of investment flexibility. And importantly, for many of our clients, it's removed the currency risk off the table by converting their sterling UK pension into Australian dollars, even though the policy stays in the UK. So as it says in the first 2 bullet points, it's the multi-currency ability to consider. And if the exchange rate is particularly good and you're quite comfortable with, again, taking that risk off the table, the SIPP gives you the ability to achieve that goal. The other thing I talked about, again, it's with regards to estate planning. Okay, it's passing potentially more of your assets to your beneficiaries, your spouse, potentially, if you pass away under the age of 75, especially compared to that defined benefit pension, which again might be just 50% of the income stream. And the final point there is you can have as much input to the investment of the pension as you wish. So a very quick and relatively simple case study here. So John, great name for this client here. Age under 55, has 2 company pension schemes in the UK. They're totaling $350,000, which he wants to eventually transfer to Australia. So of course, we can't directly transfer to a QROPS because he's 2 years away. So what we would do in the meantime is actually consolidate those 2 policies together, either a SIPP or a personal pension, and then invest those funds, again, depending on his goals and his willingness to convert at that point in time to Australian dollars. Find a portfolio that's suitable for him. Then we can prepare everything for age 55, transferring it to a QROPS in Australia. And as per before, commence that transfer strategy in line with the NCC caps of the day. So there is some work that we can certainly do before a person turns 55, especially around that currency piece, which is incredibly important. What if you're then over age 55? So again, option 1 is always look at retaining the benefits in the UK. That might be the best solution for you, irrespective of what the long-term tax outcomes are going to be, especially if you have defined benefits, especially if you have some sort of guarantee, or if you have a low capacity for taking on that investment risk yourself and actually keeping something which the employer is bearing all that risk is actually in your better interest. Option 2, though, transfer to the Australian QROPS. So the next case study is for Janet. Janet's 60. She has a defined benefit scheme with a transfer value of $740,000. So she would like to transfer that money to Australia because she wants to use those funds to help repay the mortgage. Okay, so it goes without saying, first of all, we would have to look at the suitability of the transfer in the first instance. So again, making sure her risk profile, her appetite for taking on that change of product from a defined benefit to a money purchase scheme is in her best interest. If it is, then we go through these steps. Consolidate firstly into a SIPP is typically what we'd look at. The reason being, don't forget that we've got only 3 months to decide upon with that cash equivalent transfer value for this type of DB scheme. So by consolidating into a pension in the UK, firstly, it really buys us time. It buys us time also to do a segmented transfer over potentially a few years. So what we can do is transfer the money into a SIPP. We can concurrently set up a QROPS in Australia and then begin the transfer strategy across. Because in this instance, Janet has met her preservation age, which is age 60 in Australia currently, she can then start accessing some of that fund in that QROPS vehicle. So she can withdraw a lump sum to help repay her debts and invest the remaining funds if needed. So this part of this slide really just talks about what a QROPS is. Okay, so we're going all the way back to 2006. Some of you might remember Gordon Brown was the Chancellor at that point in time. He was the person that actually introduced QROPS. It's a date in 2006 they now reference as A Day. The idea was that a lot of people were leaving the UK at that point in time, and the charges on accessing your UK pension was quite punitive. So the idea that Gordon Brown came up with was for pensions to be more mobile, and for residents leaving the country, it would give them a route to achieve that. So the QROPS legislation was born. It set out the guidelines for these overseas pension schemes, and importantly, it set out the fact that it must retain certain requirements set by HMRC. So a QROPS is really for those people that have left the UK permanently. And I say that because once you transfer your money from the UK to Australia, for example, we can't reverse that decision. There is no such transfer mechanism from the Australian super system back to Australia. So it's a very important decision to make sure we understand really what the long-term objectives of each and every client is, and that residing in Australia is what they really truly want to do throughout their retirement. As with everything, there's been legislation changes over the years. So just to name a few here, back in 2015, HMRC changed the rules. I talked about unfunded government schemes. So in the past, you could transfer NHS pension schemes, for example. They closed that because of the cost to the government, effectively. So they closed unfunded transfers. They also introduced what's known as a pension age test, which is for a QROPS, you have to be at least 55 years and above to be able to transfer across. And the reason for that really is because in Australia, especially, there is a condition of release where under circumstances of severe financial hardship, you can actually access your funds. So that didn't really fit well with the current UK rules at that point in time. So HMRC introduced this pension age test to say that every QROPS, every member must be at least 55 years and above. And for that reason, what was 1,600 odd QROP schemes in Australia, so all the big super funds had QROP status, they no longer could meet that requirement because, of course, they weren't going to forego their members, let's say Australian super, they weren't going to forego their members who are age 54 and younger because that's a big part of their book. So they all lost their QROP status, which is where we are left with today. Only two pension schemes, the self-managed super fund and that retail scheme, they would restrict access to that particular super to, again, 55-year-olds and above. 2015 also, again, I talked about this before, but for a CETV with a value of more than £30,000, you have to take a license advice to look at transferring those just because of the impact it has on your long-term retirement planning. In 2017, something called the OTC came into play, which is a 25% tax charge introduced for scheme transfers where the member does not reside in the same country. So again, just that example I mentioned before, if you bring your money over to Australia into an Australian QROPS, but then you leave within a period of time, you can be charged at up to 25% of that what's called ring-fenced amount. So the reason they brought this in was because of a few suppose, individuals in the UK, which were transferring their UK policies to QROPs in, I suppose, more tax favorable jurisdictions without actually residing in those jurisdictions. And so they were transferring the UK pensions across, largely withdrawing them without any tax whatsoever, while still residing in the UK. So because of that, HMRC saw that it was a huge loophole, and they brought into this new kind of tax act, the 25% tax charge. In July 2017, this is now a legislative change, from the ATO perspective, is that superannuation caps have changed. So back in 2017, they were $180,000 per year for your NCC caps. They immediately dropped to $100,000. So the capital mobility, what we use to bring a UK pension across to Australia, has changed each and every year. And they are increasing once again. Again, the $120,000 per year at the moment, hopefully moving to $130,000 per year at the moment, but not quite as beneficial as it was back in 2017. So why would you want to look at a QROPS? Well, of course, you have the money now in a country which you reside in. You can have the money in Australian dollars or sterling if you want to hold that for a period of time. You enhance potentially the estate planning for your dependents, the enhanced tax treatments on income, especially, as I mentioned before. And whilst you can't roll over the QROPS to a non-QROPS fund for a period of time, you can do the inverse of that. So you've got other super outside of the QROPS. You can bring those assets into the QROPS scheme, especially if it's a self-managed super fund. So if your goals are for consolidation, for ease of management, for example, you can still meet your wider financial planning goals through that tool. But QROPS does come with a number of responsibilities. So there is going to be a 10-year reporting period from the date of the transfer. So this is more of an administrative exercise more than anything. But still, again, as I mentioned before, you really have to understand what your long-term obligations are, because it's not as simple as moving your money across tomorrow and forgetting about it. It's going to be a 10-year time frame to keep reporting this back to HMRC. We've got to ensure that any QROPS that we help a client or a client sets up for themselves is invested and benefits received broadly in line with the UK rules. So when I think about investments, especially, I'm thinking about what's a non-allowable asset in a UK pension. The key one that springs to mind is direct residential property. Okay, you can't have that in a UK pension. So even though it's actually a fairly popular strategy in Australia, a number of people have investment properties within their self-managed super fund. That as an asset would be non-allowable to HMRC, and therefore you would breach your rules, breach your obligations, and incur a tax penalty if you were to use your UK pension money to buy that property. And then finally, comply with those what's called the member payment provision periods, which is typically 5-year periods from the date of the transfer. So again, making sure a member isn't rolling from a QROPS to a non-QROPS within that period of time, because again, that would be breaching HMRC and QROPS legislation, which you don't want to do, because as I mentioned on one of the very first slides, the tax penalties can be as high as 55%. So yeah, punitive. Want to make sure you understand what you can and cannot do with this QROPS money. So that said, we're on to kind of section 4, which is the transfer process. Andrew, if you're there, I think you're going to step in here.
Thank you, John, for that.
Great.
Very much so. So yeah, thank you for taking us through the content of the presentation. I do hope everyone enjoyed it from at this point, or basically, and did find some value in what John has been talking about for the last basically half an hour or so. So thanks, John. Just moving ahead. So if we look ahead, so basically part of the process, why BDH Sterling is how we look at it. So just moving ahead with the slides, John. So BDH Sterling. So we are a chartered firm in the UK. We have a dual license. Have dual license advisors in both jurisdictions and have the necessary permissions to provide pension transfer advice. Defined benefit scheme specialists. So FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK, regulates permissions in defined benefit advice, which is very limited, and there are far fewer firms that provide, or I suppose, permissions that there used to be. We have over 16 years experience in UK pensions transfers. We have advice provided in houses in both Australia and the UK through our global offices, which include London, Perth, and Sydney. We are very well rated and have high client satisfaction, and we are also able to provide advice in other financial areas outside of just normal UK pension transfers. So we also provide advice in regards to Australian superannuation. We also look at tax advice through our partner firm with BDH Tax. We look at retirement planning. We also look, which is not mentioned on the slide, we also look at investment plan. We also look at investment advice as well, and also regarding personal insurance advice too. Now, Q&A session. So it's time now to have to answer some of the questions that have been asked, and we do have a lot of questions. So many thanks for those that have actually provided questions. A quick reminder for those wanting to ask questions, please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A rather than the chat section, and we will try and answer as many as possible. Now, just quickly, also, there is a lot of questions that have been put into the Q&A box that are more specific to people's needs. We will only be looking at today just more of the general questions, but please reach out to us, and if you do have a specific question about your or specific scenarios, please reach out to us, and we will be able to try and assist you as best as we can. But let's move on to some of the questions overall. So just first off, John, just quickly. So do you have to be a permanent resident to use CUROPS, or does it apply to temporary residents on a bridging visa? John, just quickly, you're on mute.
Thanks, Andrew. Okay, so good question. You don't have to be a permanent resident to transfer your benefits to CUROPS. There's nothing in the legislation with regards to that status. It is important to know, though, with regards to accessing super, and temporary residents typically do not have access to superannuation. And so we got to really assess what I suppose the prospects are for you gaining permanent residency, because of course we wouldn't want to bring your money into Australia if you aren't going to get PR, and therefore wouldn't have an access to those funds. So not explicitly against the rules, but implicitly we'd need to assess if that's going to be in your interest.
Thank you very much, John. I hope that answered the question from one of our participants. The second one, John, is my UK defined contribution pot equates to about $1 million Australian. Does this mean it will take about 6 or 7 years to transfer to Australia, given the annual limits?
Okay, good question again. Not necessarily is my answer there. So don't forget, we are talking about non-concessional limits. So I presume that's where the question has come from and stemmed from, is the fact that we can only transfer $120,000 per year or $360,000 every 3 years. But don't forget, you also have the first component, which is the applicable fund earnings. So any growth you've had on that UK pension policy since you've been in Australia, that is the first transfer mechanism. Okay, so that might be a sizable part of that $1 million. And yes, you do pay tax on it, but it doesn't fall under the NCC caps. So we might find that it's not quite as long to transfer your pension across as may seem on the surface.
Thank you very much. Okay, next one. On the CUROPS, can you draw down on these?
Yes, absolutely. So the way that I like to think about things, and the way that I talk about this to my own clients, is that even though your super is a CUROPS, That's just a designation. That's more than anything, it's a reporting requirement back to HMRC. At the heart of it, it's a superannuation, just like with perhaps your existing super that you've already got. So the same rules would apply, i.e., you get to your retirement date or beyond age 60 typically, and you can start to access those benefits. Now, there are going to be overlaps with QROPS rules, making sure we can access that amount of money tax effectively, because you can go wrong with having to pay tax on the withdrawals from a QROPS. But if you do things correctly, then yeah, it's all as per the superannuation tax, which is for income streams, no tax payable, non-assessable income.
Thank you. Next question is, what balance would make a QROPS SMSF worthwhile? I'll give John a break and answer that one for him. Generally, we basically say around about 500,000, 600,000 is pretty much the line in the sand. However, while an SMSF can provide you with basically greater control and flexibility and potential cost efficiencies, it also introduces important responsibilities. That's got to remember. These include increased management, administrative duties, and ongoing compliance obligations that you will need to oversee. So that's what you need to weigh up in regards to basically, do you look at a self-made super fund, or do you look at another QROPS alternative through an industry super fund? John, I'll take it back to you now. If you transfer SIP funds into a QROPS, can you then take the full amount out immediately tax-free?
Potentially, yes, you can. Again, there are within that 5-year window, especially after transferring the benefits, there's what's called the member payment provision period. We do have to be cognizant of how we are accessing benefits from QROPS because there is a potential tax implication. But if we structure the withdrawals correctly, and of course, if you meet the requirements to access your super, then yeah, we can get access to that if that's in your best interest.
Thanks, John. John, next question. How does a UK LTA affect the transfer process?
Okay, so LTA was on one of the previous slides. So actually, LTA has now been abolished. We're now dealing with other types of restrictions, I suppose, from a UK pension legislative framework. So what we're really dealing with is the overseas transfer allowance, which again is typically circa £1.07 million. So we do have to work within that space. Okay, otherwise any money that we're bringing across from the UK to Australia would potentially be taxed at 25% on that excess amount. So really, it's understanding how much the client has, potentially what's previous benefit crystallization events the client has had in the past as well, and working out a strategy around those kind of 3 pillars that I talked about to find the most effective way to access and to gain access to the UK pension policy.
Thanks, John. Next question we've got, just checking out time. If you take a tax-free cash lump sum from your UK pension, either in a SIP or the defined benefit scheme, will it be taxable in Australia?
Good question. Yes, broadly speaking, it would be. Obviously, trying to understand the personal circumstances of that client who's asked the question. You might remember in the slides I talked about how lump sums can be taxed at your marginal rates, but it does depend on that applicable fund earnings calculation and really working out whether there's tax to pay there. Now, typically, if you take the lump sum out as your first kind of port of call, then the ATO would tax that personally. There are other strategies we can do to make sure those lump sums are tax-free, but it depends on what, again, the client's circumstances are, what they've done in the past with regards to accessing the policy.
Gotcha. Thank you, John. Next question. Can you say more about transferring funds already in drawdown, having already taken the tax-free 25%?
Yeah, okay. This is an interesting one. So historically, actually, when a client went into drawdown in the UK, the entire pension policy became what's known as crystallized. So again, the way that I like to think about that is it became kind of glued together. So we couldn't break it up into component parts to enact a transfer to Australia. There are pension providers now that have the ability to segment a crystallized pension pot. So even though that client there maybe has already taken their 25% tax-free cash, we can still definitely help them with a transfer strategy.
Okay, no, thank you very much. Okay, next. In what instance would you recommend to leave UK pension in the UK rather than transfer to Australia?
Okay, so again, that goes back to, I think, all of the topics we talked on around the guarantees of the pension scheme. So the crux of it is we want to make sure the client is financially better off, or as best we can ascertain, is going to be financially better off by transferring the policy to Australia or retaining the policy in the UK. So what we do a lot is a lot of cash flow modeling, working out the tax of both scenarios to work out where they're going to have a better financial outcome. So again, it depends on their own capacity for taking on that risk, like we talked about before. It talks about any guarantees the policy might have. And from those discussions with the client, these modelings that we do for the clients, we can then ascertain which is the best scenario for them.
Good, excellent. John, hi. If we transfer UK pension to Oz and then return to the UK at some stage, can we transfer the super pension back to the UK?
Not within the policy itself. So you can't re-establish a UK pension policy. So no, is the very simple answer to that one, Andrew.
No, thank you, John, very much. John, you mentioned that the NIS state pension can't be transferred. Does this mean it is then taxed first in UK and then also in Australia if DREP, fed or accessed?
No. So the UK state pension is a pension scheme, even in the UK, it's paid out gross, so it's not taxed, that's sourced by HMRC. Again, because you're Australian resident, I might presume, I actually don't know the circumstances of this person, but assuming they are tax resident in Australia, then the ATO have taxing rights on their worldwide income and their worldwide assets. So again, under that approach, it wouldn't be taxed in the UK, but you would have to disclose it on your Australian tax return.
No worries, thank you. Next question, and many of you have asked this question, is basically will we be providing the slides that we've shown today? The answer is no, but however, we will provide a link to the video that's been played today. So or the recording will be available within the next 48 hours. So look out for that. Just quickly also, John, while we've got time still, if you transfer from a UK defined benefit is greater than $330,000 with the bring forward, and you want to transfer the full amount to an SMSF, how is the additional amount treated?
Good question. So if you breach the non-concessional cap, that would be considered an excess contribution. So it's not something that we typically would be recommending to clients. The reason being is that the ATO would apply a tax penalty on that excess. So they would require you to release the funds from super. That would get paid into your personal name with an extra tax implication as well. So it is something we can talk to clients about, but typically, like we said before, we would want to ideally do a phased approach over potentially a few years to maximize the tax efficiency for the clients. There would have to be a very good reason we go down the route of an over contribution.
Just quickly, John, this might be the last question, I think, for the session. So I do apologise for others. John, how do you know if your superannuation fund is a QROPS fund?
So you can find it, hopefully, on the HMRC website. So they have a list of all QROPS globally. So if you can go onto the website, you can filter by country, and you'll see if your QROPS is listed there. Yeah, really, that's the key reason. If it is listed, you should also have access to a scheme reference number as well. So depending on what your scheme is, maybe it's a self-managed super fund, then you should have a scheme reference number. If it's the retail CureOps, then that will be within the product literature itself.
Okay, so it is now on the hour, so we might just finish up now. So look, a lot of you have written a lot more questions, and so we do apologise we couldn't get to them all today. If you do, please don't hesitate to reach out to us on inquiries@bdhsterling.com. So that's inquiries@bdhsterling.com. If you want to talk about your specific situation, or if you just want to basically reach out and have a chat to us, we will be very much more than happy to have a chat and see what the top of advice we can provide or help you with. But thanks again for everyone who has taken some time out of their day today to attend. We trust that the session and information provided hopefully has been of value to you. As I mentioned before, a recording of the session will be available for you over the next 40 hours. Please feel free to reach out to us directly if you do have any specific questions, as I mentioned before. I also encourage you to keep an eye out for the feedback survey. This is a short, just 4 questions. It will come at the end of the session and also in the email with the slides. Your time with that would be greatly appreciated. I promise you that. So once again, on behalf of BDH Sterling, thank you for your time. I know John and I have enjoyed ourselves immensely, and we do hope to be in contact with you and speak to you in the very near future. So thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your week.
All right. Thanks all. Take care.